The jagged edge of a sandstone outcrop bit into Jedediah Stone's cheek as another volley of rifle fire whined overhead, chipping away at his meager cover. Dust and grit filled his nostrils, mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder and his own sweat. His repeater was down to its last 3 rounds, a grim tally he'd been keeping with a sinking heart. Days now, he'd been hounded across this god's-forsaken territory, ever since the botched job in Redemption Pass. He'd thought he'd lost them in the canyons, but these weren't just opportunistic bandits, they were tenacious, like wolves on a blood trail. His shoulder throbbed where a bullet had grazed him 2 suns ago, the wound hot and angry beneath his torn shirt. He risked a glance, squinting against the merciless glare. At least 3, maybe 4, shadows flitted between the rocks 100 yards distant, their movements patient, assured. They knew he was trapped. The high desert offered little beyond sparse scrub and unforgiving stone, a panorama of desolation that mirrored the state of his soul. He wasn't a good man, not anymore. The war had scoured that out of him, replaced it with a hard pragmatism that bordered on callousness. But he was a survivor. Or he had been. Now, pinned down, bleeding, with the vultures already circling in his mind's eye, survival felt like a distant memory. He pressed himself flatter, the sun beating down, baking the rock until it felt like a griddle. Thirst clawed at his throat. His canteen had been empty since morning. This was a bad way to die, he thought, not with a bang, but whittled away by heat and unseen enemies. He'd always imagined a quicker end, a final blaze of glory perhaps, or at least a fight where he could see his killer's eyes. This slow, anonymous demise felt like a cruel joke, a fitting epitaph for a life lived on the fringes, always running from something, usually himself. He shifted, trying to find a less agonizing position, and a loose pebble skittered down the rock face, a tiny betrayal in the vast silence between shots. He cursed under his breath. They'd know his position was becoming untenable. They'd wait. Or they'd rush him. Neither option appealed. He had to move, find a new angle, any advantage, however slight. One last gamble. It was all he had left. His fingers tightened on the worn stock of his rifle. 3 shots. Make them count. He took a ragged breath, then lunged from behind the outcrop, firing a wild shot to suppress, and scrambled towards a narrow fissure in the canyon wall he'd spotted earlier. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels, one singing past his ear with an angry hum. He dove headfirst into the shadowed cleft, scraping his knees and hands, the repeater clattering beside him. For a moment, blessed coolness enveloped him, the rock walls damp and smelling of ancient earth. He lay there, panting, heart hammering against his ribs, listening. The gunfire outside paused. They'd be regrouping, wondering where he'd vanished. The fissure was deeper than he'd thought, twisting back into the rock. Maybe, just maybe, it was a way out, or at least a temporary reprieve. He pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and peered into the gloom. That's when he saw her. Not 10 feet away, pressed into a deeper recess, was a girl, barely a woman. Her eyes, wide and dark in the dim light, were fixed on him, reflecting a primal fear that transcended language. She was native, a deerskin dress simple but well-made, a single feather woven into her dark, braided hair. She held no weapon he could see, only an abject terror that made her seem small, fragile. He'd stumbled from one deadly trap into another. His first instinct, honed by years of frontier conflict, was to see her as a threat, an accomplice to his pursuers. But her fear was too raw, too genuine. She wasn't with them. She looked at his dusty, bloodied form, at the rifle in his hand, and he saw the certainty in her eyes. She expected death. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of cornered animals, in the faces of men who knew their time was up. He was the monster in her shadows, the embodiment of a threat her people had known for generations. He lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture he hoped conveyed non-aggression, though in this cramped space, with his heart still pounding, it probably looked like he was just adjusting his aim. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant, muffled shouts of the men hunting him. The shouts outside grew closer, more organized. Jed knew they wouldn't give up easily. He glanced back at the fisher's entrance, a narrow slit of blinding daylight, then at the girl. Her eyes hadn't left him, still wide with that terrible expectation. He could leave her, try to find another way out, assuming this passage even led anywhere. It was the sensible thing to do, the survivor's choice. She was not his concern. But then, a fresh volley of shots impacted the rock near the entrance, sending splinters flying. They were probing, trying to draw him out or confirm he was still inside. The girl flinched violently, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. He saw her hands clench, her knuckles white. She was preparing for the inevitable, for him to use her as a shield, or kill her to silence her, or simply ignore her as she was caught in the crossfire. That look again, that resignation. It gnawed at something deep inside him, something he thought long dead. He thought of his sister, her face pale and frightened, a memory he usually kept buried. He made a decision then, one that defied all logic, all ingrained instinct. It wasn't a noble decision, not really. Maybe it was just weariness, a sudden, inexplicable urge to do one thing right in a life filled with wrongs. Or maybe it was the sheer injustice of her terror. He turned fully towards the entrance, his back momentarily to her. He could feel her gaze on him, probably expecting a bullet. Instead, he raised his repeater, checking the 2 remaining rounds. "Stay down," he rasped, his voice harsh from thirst and disuse. He didn't know if she understood the words, but the intent, the sudden shift in his posture from potential threat to protector, must have been clear. He saw a flicker of disbelief in her eyes, a tiny crack in the wall of her fear. Then, one of his pursuers, bolder than the rest, darted past the opening. Jed didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle, fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. A yelp, cut short, from outside. One down. He risked a quick look. The man was sprawled on the ground, unmoving. The others would be more cautious now, but also angrier. He looked back at the girl. She was staring at him, not with fear anymore, but with a profound, stunned confusion. He, the cowboy, the enemy, had just defended her. He had killed one of his own kind, seemingly to protect her. The air crackled with the unspoken question. He didn't have an answer for her, or for himself. He just knew he couldn't let them get to her. He gestured deeper into the fissure. "Go. If there's a way out, find it." She didn't move for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face, trying to decipher the impossible. Then, slowly, as if breaking a spell, she nodded. She turned and slipped further into the darkness of the passage, her movement surprisingly swift and silent. Jed reloaded his last precious round, his mind racing. What in God's name was he doing? Protecting a native girl he didn't know from men who were, ostensibly, his own people, even if they were scum. It was madness. Suicide, most likely. He listened. The silence outside was heavier now, more menacing. They knew he was still in there, and they knew he was dangerous. He heard a low murmur of voices, then the distinct sound of someone trying to scale the rocks above the fissure. They were trying to get a vantage point, maybe drop something down. He pressed himself against the rock wall, looking up into the sliver of sky. Nothing. He waited. A few minutes later, the girl returned, her expression urgent. She pointed deeper into the fissure, then made a series of quick, articulate gestures. He didn't understand the specifics, but the general meaning was clear. There was a way out, but it was narrow, difficult. She then pointed back towards the entrance, a grim look on her face, and made a cutting motion across her throat. They were trapped between his pursuers and whatever lay ahead. She then touched her chest, then his, and then pointed again towards the narrow passage, an unspoken pact forming in the dim light. "We go together." He nodded. It was their only chance. As they prepared to move, she hesitated, then reached into a small pouch at her belt. She pulled out a strip of dried meat and a small, intricately woven water skin, offering them to him. His surprise must have shown on his face. He hadn't eaten properly in days, and his canteen was bone dry. He took them, his fingers brushing hers. A small shock, not unpleasant. "Thank you," he mumbled, taking a cautious bite of the meat. It was tough, smoky, but it was sustenance. The water was cool and clean, the most precious gift in this arid hell. He watched her as he drank. She was still wary, but the stark terror had been replaced by a cautious curiosity, and something else, the shared sense of purpose. She then spoke, her voice soft, melodic, the words unfamiliar to his ears, but her tone was serious. She pointed to herself. "Iona," she said, touching her chest. Then she pointed at him. He hesitated. "Jed," he replied. "Jed Stone," she repeated his name, the syllables sounding strange and foreign on her tongue. Jed, a small, almost imperceptible nod. An introduction made in the heart of danger. It was then that a shadow fell over the fisher's entrance. Cale, for that was the name Iona had hissed with a mixture of fear and fury once they were clear of the immediate ambush, was relentless. She'd explained, through a combination of halting English words picked up from traders, vivid gestures, and drawings scratched into the dust with a twig, that he was of her own people, the Swift River tribe. But Cale was a zealot, a purist who believed she had defiled their most sacred tradition by refusing a binding oath, an alliance with a neighboring, warlike clan meant to secure their borders. Her refusal, she conveyed, was seen not just as disobedience but as a dangerous omen, a crack in the spiritual defenses of their people. Cale and his warriors, self-appointed guardians of the old ways, had been tasked with bringing her back for judgment, or silencing her permanently if she resisted. Her crime, it seemed, was wanting a different path, a future not dictated by fear and antiquated pacts. Jed listened, the pieces falling into place. The men who'd initially pinned him down were likely opportunists, a hazard of the territory. Cale's pursuit was something far more personal, far more dangerous. And now, Jed was caught in the middle of it. He'd made a choice back in that fissure, a choice that had irrevocably tied his fate to Iona's. His initial shock at his own actions had given way to a grim resolve. He'd seen enough of blind fanaticism in the war to recognize its ugly face in Iona's description of Cale. They traveled for days, Iona leading them through hidden trails and forgotten pathways that Jed, for all his years on the frontier, had never known existed. She moved with a grace and certainty that spoke of a deep connection to the land, reading signs in the bent grass, the flight of birds, the scent of the wind, that were invisible to him. He, in turn, taught her how to handle his spare Colt revolver, its unfamiliar weight and mechanism initially awkward in her hands, but she was a quick study, her focus intense. They spoke little, the silence often more comfortable than forced conversation. Yet, a bond was forming, forged in shared hardship and the constant threat of discovery. He learned the rhythm of her watchfulness, she the gruff kindness that lay beneath his hardened exterior. He found himself admiring her resilience, her quiet strength. She was no helpless victim. She was a survivor, just like him, albeit of a different kind of wilderness. They saw signs of Cale's pursuit often, a deliberately broken arrow left on a trail, the ashes of a recent campfire, too close for comfort. The noose was tightening. Jed felt a familiar weariness, but also a new, unwelcome flicker of responsibility. He'd meant to drift, to avoid entanglement, but Iona's plight, her quiet defiance, had stirred something in him. Perhaps it was a chance at a small redemption, a way to balance the ledger of his past failures. He owed her that much for sharing her meager water and food, for trusting him when she had every reason not to. The first direct confrontation with Cale's warriors came at dusk, as they were making camp in a shallow, defensible arroyo. Iona sensed them first, her head snapping up, her body tensing like a startled deer. "They come," she whispered, her eyes wide. Jed was on his feet instantly, repeater in hand, scanning the rim of the arroyo. He saw movement, a flicker of buckskin against the darkening sandstone. There were at least 5 of them, spreading out, trying to encircle their position. Cale was not among them, Jed noted, these were scouts, or perhaps a spearhead. "Get down," he yelled, shoving Iona towards the deepest part of the gully. The air erupted with war cries and the twang of bowstrings. Arrows thudded into the earth around them, one slicing through the sleeve of Jed's shirt. He returned fire, his shots carefully aimed, trying to make each one count. Iona, to his surprise, didn't just hide. She had her own bow, light and swift, and she sent arrows arcing towards their attackers with deadly accuracy. Her movements were fluid, economical, a warrior in her own right. He saw one of Cale's men stumble, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. They fought back to back, a strange and desperate alliance, the weathered cowboy and the exiled native girl. His repeater against their bows and lances, her knowledge of the terrain and their tactics against his raw firepower. The fight was brutal, close quarters, a flurry of desperate action. Jed took a glancing blow from a war club that sent stars dancing before his eyes, but he stayed on his feet, firing, reloading, his motions mechanical, born of countless skirmishes. Iona let out a sharp cry as an arrow grazed her arm. Seeing her injured ignited a cold fury in Jed. He surged forward, firing his Colt, forcing the attackers back momentarily. The skirmish was short but savage. Realizing they couldn't easily overwhelm them, and having taken casualties, the warriors melted back into the twilight as quickly as they had appeared, their retreat punctuated by frustrated yells. Jed rushed to Iona's side. The wound was shallow, bleeding freely but not life-threatening. He tore a strip from his already tattered shirt and bound it tightly, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. "They will bring Cale now," she said, her eyes dark with foreboding. "He will not be so easily turned." News of their unlikely partnership, Jed suspected, must be spreading like wildfire. A white man, a cowboy no less, fighting alongside an outcast native woman against her own people, it was the kind of tale that would set tongues wagging from isolated trading posts to dusty frontier towns. The shockwaves of his decision in that fissure were beginning to ripple outwards. Iona knew of a place, a sanctuary she called the Whispering Caves, hidden deep within a sacred mountain her people seldom visited, save for their most revered elders. It was there, she believed, they might find guidance, perhaps even temporary safety from Cale's relentless pursuit. The journey was arduous, leading them higher into the rugged peaks, through treacherous passes where the wind howled like a banshee and the air grew thin and cold. Jed, more accustomed to the plains and low canyons, found himself struggling, but Iona moved with an almost ethereal grace, her knowledge of these forbidding heights unwavering. She shared stories of the caves, of ancient spirits and prophesies, her voice soft against the roar of the wind. Jed, a man of grit and gunpowder, listened with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. Her world was so different from his, yet their shared desperation bridged the chasm of culture and belief. He found himself less inclined to dismiss her words as mere superstition. He'd seen too many inexplicable things on the frontier to be entirely closed-minded. The entrance to the Whispering Caves was concealed behind a waterfall, its roaring curtain of water parting to reveal a dark, narrow opening. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the silence profound after the constant assault of the wind. Tunnels, carved by ancient waters, branched off in every direction, their walls shimmering with strange mineral deposits that cast faint, ethereal light. Iona led him confidently through the labyrinthine passages until they reached a vast central cavern. In its center, seated before a low, smoky fire, was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes possessing a startling, timeless clarity. This was Niall, Iona explained in a hushed tone, the keeper of stories, an elder of immense wisdom, respected even by those who now hunted Iona. Niall showed no surprise at their arrival, her gaze lingering on Jed with an unnerving intensity. Iona spoke to her at length in their native tongue, her voice pleading, urgent. Jed watched, understanding little of the words but grasping the gravity of the exchange. Niall listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice raspy but firm. Iona translated. Niall confirmed that Cale's fanaticism was indeed a threat, not just to Iona, but to the delicate balance of their tribe. Cale, she revealed, was driven by a misinterpretation of an old prophecy, believing Iona's independent spirit signaled a coming darkness. But Niall also hinted that Cale himself might be a pawn, his fear stoked by others within the tribal council who saw Iona's defiance as a challenge to their own power. There was more at stake than just a broken tradition. Jed felt a familiar tightening in his gut. This was no longer a simple matter of protecting a girl, it was about confronting a deeper corruption, a perversion of belief. His own past failures, the faces of those he couldn't save, flickered in his mind. He had run from responsibility for too long. Perhaps here, in this strange, sacred place, he could finally make a stand. Neil then looked directly at Jed. "The path you walk is stained with blood, yours and others," Iona translated her elder's words. "But the spirit within you seeks a cleaner trail." Helping her, she gestured to Iona, "may cleanse more than just her name." The sanctuary of the Whispering Caves offered a brief respite, but Neil made it clear it was not a permanent solution. Cale's influence was growing, fueled by fear and superstition. To truly save Iona, and perhaps expose the deeper manipulation within the tribe, they needed a plan, a way to confront Cale not just with force, but with truth. Neil, while offering wisdom, could not directly intervene in tribal law. That burden fell to Iona, and by extension, to Jed. Iona proposed a daring strategy, to return to the edge of her village, not to surrender, but to invoke the right of challenge, an ancient and seldom used law that allowed an accused to face their accuser before the entire tribe and the council of elders. It was incredibly risky. If she failed to sway them, the judgment would be swift and final. Jed argued against it, the pragmatist in him screaming at the foolhardiness of walking back into the lion's den. But Iona was resolute. "It is the only way, Jed Stone," she insisted, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "To run forever is not living. My people must hear the truth," not just Cale's twisted words. He saw the same unwavering spirit that had led her to defy the initial binding oath. He also saw, with a sinking feeling, that his own path was now inextricably linked to hers. He couldn't abandon her now, not after everything. His arc of redemption, he was beginning to understand, was tied to her fate. "All right," he said finally, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "But we do this my way too. We'll need a contingency." His contingencies involved scouting the village outskirts, understanding Cale's defenses, and finding a defensible position should the right of challenge go sour, which he fully expected it to. Neil provided them with crucial information about the village layout and the temperament of certain elders who might be sympathetic, or at least open to reason. She also gave Iona a small, intricately carved amulet. "May the spirits of our ancestors guide your tongue and protect your heart," she said, her voice softer now. Before they left, Jed took time to clean his weapons meticulously. He showed Iona again how to use the Colt, how to clear a jam, how to aim for center mass. Her proficiency was growing, her natural warrior instincts adapting quickly to the unfamiliar firearm. There was a grim efficiency to their preparations. They were no longer just two disparate souls thrown together by chance, they were a team, a small, desperate army of two against a deeply entrenched ideology. The news of their alliance, carried by unseen messengers, trappers, traders, perhaps even members of Cale's own war party who'd witnessed Jed's defense of Iona, had indeed begun to permeate the sparse settlements and lonely ranches of the territory. Whispers of the cowboy who fought for a native girl, defying all expectations and prejudices, were met with disbelief, ridicule, but also a grudging, astonished respect in some quarters. The West was a place of rigid codes and harsh divisions, and their actions were a stone dropped into a still, murky pond, the ripples spreading further than they could imagine. The edge of the Swift River encampment was heavily guarded. Cale's warriors, their faces painted with severe, intimidating patterns, patrolled the perimeter, their vigilance a testament to their leader's paranoia. Jed and Iona observed from a wooded bluff overlooking the valley where the village nestled by a winding river. Smoke rose from numerous campfires, the sounds of daily life drifting up to them, children's laughter, the rhythmic beat of a drum, the murmur of voices. It looked peaceful, yet Jed felt a palpable tension in the air. Iona took a deep breath, clutching Neil's amulet. "It is time," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he saw in her hands. According to their plan, Iona would approach the village openly at dawn, unarmed save for the amulet, and declare her intention to invoke the right of challenge. Jed, meanwhile, would position himself at a prearranged vantage point, covering her approach, ready to intervene if Cale's men tried to seize her before she could speak. It was a thin plan, relying heavily on the tribe's adherence to their own ancient laws, a concept Jed found increasingly dubious given Cale's fanaticism. As the first rays of sun touched the peaks, Iona began her descent. Jed watched through his rifle sights, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the awakening village. He saw her walk into the open, her figure small and solitary against the vastness of the land. Warriors spotted her immediately. Shouts erupted. Men scrambled for weapons. For a terrifying moment, Jed thought they would cut her down. But then, an older warrior, perhaps a sub-chief, held up a hand, and Iona was allowed to approach the central gathering space. Cale himself emerged from a large lodge, his presence imposing, his eyes burning with a cold fire as he saw her. He was taller than Jed had imagined, powerfully built, the personification of righteous fury. Iona's clear voice carried across the distance as she made her declaration. Even without understanding the words, Jed could feel the weight of tradition in her tone. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. A tense parley ensued. Elders gathered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a runner was dispatched, presumably to inform Cale that the council would hear her. The rite was on. Jed exhaled slowly, but his relief was short-lived. This was only the beginning. The real battle, the one of words and wills, was about to commence, and if that failed, the battle of bullets and blood would surely follow. He scanned the crowd, noting the positions of Cale's most loyal warriors, his mind already calculating trajectories and escape routes. The shock to the whole Wester was no longer just a rumor, it was about to have a very public, very dangerous stage. The rite of challenge took place in the great council circle, the entire tribe gathered as witnesses. Iona stood alone in the center, facing Cale and the seated elders. Jed watched from his concealed position, the sun climbing higher, baking the landscape. He could only see glimpses of the proceedings, but the tension was a living thing, coiling around the village. Iona spoke first, her voice, though not loud, carrying a surprising authority. She recounted her reasons for refusing the oath, speaking of her desire for her people to find strength not through forced alliances born of fear, but through their own spirit and wisdom. She challenged the interpretation of the prophecy Cale clung to, offering a different vision, one of hope and adaptation rather than rigid adherence to a past that no longer served them. Then Cale spoke. His voice was a resonant roar, filled with accusation and dire warnings. He painted Iona as a heretic, a harbinger of destruction, her defiance a betrayal that would bring ruin upon them all. He gestured towards Jed's unseen presence, or perhaps the rumors of him, citing the unnatural alliance with an outsider as further proof of her corruption. Jed could see the crowd swaying, some nodding at Cale's fiery rhetoric, others looking troubled, uncertain. The elders listened, their faces impassive. The debate raged for hours. It became clear that Cale's power was not absolute, there were dissenting voices among the elders, those who Niall had hinted might be open to reason. But fear was a powerful weapon, and Cale wielded it masterfully. The turning point came when Iona directly confronted the whispers of manipulation Niall had spoken of. She named 2 specific council members, known for their ambition and their close ties to the warlike clan she had refused. She accused them not of malice, but of allowing their fear and greed to cloud their judgment, twisting Cale's piety to their own ends. It was a bold, dangerous move. The accused elders sputtered with outrage, but Iona held her ground, her gaze unwavering. Suddenly, one of Cale's warriors, perhaps unnerved by the shift in tone or acting on a prearranged signal, lunged towards Iona with a raised club. Before anyone could react, before Jed could even fully register the movement, a shot rang out. Not from Jed's rifle. From the crowd. The warrior stumbled, clutching his arm, his club clattering to the ground. Pandemonium erupted. In the ensuing chaos, Jed saw a young brave, armed with an old trade musket, looking defiant. He wasn't alone. A small faction of younger warriors, clearly influenced by Iona's words or tired of Cale's oppressive rule, moved to stand with her. Cale, enraged, bellowed for his loyalists to attack. The village exploded into a battle not of words, but of kin against kin. Jed had no choice. He opened fire, not into the crowd, but at Cale's most aggressive warriors who were charging Iona and her new, unexpected allies. His shots were precise, aimed to disable, to create confusion, to give Iona's faction a fighting chance. The shock of a cowboy actively, openly fighting alongside a faction within the tribe, against other members of that same tribe, was monumental. It shattered every preconceived notion. This was the true climax of the shockwave he'd started in that fissure. Cale, seeing his authority crumble and his warriors falter against the combined resistance, let out a frustrated roar and charged directly at Iona, a fanatical gleam in his eyes. The final confrontation was a maelstrom. Jed fired his repeater, forcing Cale's most ardent followers to seek cover, creating a path for Iona. She, however, did not retreat. Armed with the Colt Jed had given her, she stood her ground as Cale, knife flashing, bore down on her. The clash was brutal. Cale, a seasoned warrior, was powerful and skilled, but Iona fought with the ferocity of someone defending not just her life, but her very soul, her vision for her people. She moved with a desperate agility, using the unfamiliar weight of the revolver as much as a club as a firearm, trying to keep Cale at bay. Jed, providing covering fire, picked off Cale's lieutenants one by one, his bullets finding their mark with deadly precision, further disorienting the zealots' forces. The tide of the internal village battle began to turn as more of the uncommitted tribe members, seeing Cale's fanaticism for what it was and witnessing Iona's courage, threw their support behind her and the young braves. The two elders Iona had accused, seeing their power base disintegrate, tried to slip away but were quickly surrounded by villagers loyal to Niall's wisdom and Iona's plea for reason. Cale, realizing he was losing, that his crusade was failing, became even more reckless in his attack on Iona. He lunged, and Iona fired the Colt. The shot was deafening at close range. Cale staggered back, clutching his side, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He looked down at the blood blooming on his tunic, then back at Iona, not with hatred, but with a dawning, terrible understanding. He had been wrong. He collapsed, the fight draining out of him. Silence descended upon the council circle, broken only by the crackling of the central fire and the ragged breathing of the combatants. Iona stood, trembling, the smoking Colt still in her hand. The villagers stared, first at Cale, then at Iona, then towards the bluff where Jed's rifle smoke still drifted. The immediate threat was over. In the aftermath, Niall stepped forward, her presence calming the raw emotions. Cale was not dead, but grievously wounded, his spirit broken as much as his body. The manipulative elders were brought before the reformed council. The truth, as Iona had championed, began to unravel the web of fear and deceit. Jed made his way down into the village, his rifle held loosely at his side. He expected hostility, suspicion. Instead, he was met with looks of stunned awe, and in some eyes, gratitude. He walked to Iona's side. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion, sorrow for the conflict, and a dawning hope. "It is done," she whispered. He nodded, a weight lifting from his own shoulders. He hadn't just saved her, he had helped a people save themselves from a destructive path. His redemption felt less like a distant dream and more like a hard-won reality. The story of the cowboy and the native girl who defied a zealot and changed the course of her tribe would indeed echo through the West, a testament to an alliance no one could have predicted, an outcome that shocked everyone who heard it, challenging the bitter narratives of division and hate. The West was a vast, harsh land, but that day, a small seed of understanding, of improbable unity, had been planted. Jed Stone, the cynical drifter, had found something worth fighting for, and in doing so, had found a piece of his own lost humanity. Iona, now a leader in her own right, faced the task of healing her fractured tribe, guiding them towards the new path she had envisioned. For Jed, the future was uncertain. He could stay, an honored but still alien presence, or move on, forever changed by the girl named Iona and the stand they had made together. Whatever he chose, he knew he would no longer be just running. He would be carrying the memory of this victory, a quiet strength, a renewed purpose. The frontier was still a dangerous place, but perhaps, just perhaps, it now held a little more room for hope.